Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be looking at this blog post by Lisa Tannert about her experience with alcoholism.
Okay.
She shares this really intense story about getting evicted.
Oh, wow.
Imagine just chilling by the pool
Yeah.
and you get this news. But it's more than just a dramatic story. She uses it to explore this, I think, really interesting idea that alcoholism is like a thinking disease that's driven by the ego.
That's a really key point here. Lisa's arguing that the drinking is actually a symptom of a deeper problem, which she calls a keen alcoholic ego.
Okay.
And she even quotes from the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous to support this. Have you had a chance to read the Big Book yourself?
I actually haven't, but I'm definitely intrigued. What is the Big Book exactly?
Yeah.
And how does it tie into Lisa's argument?
So the Big Book is essentially like the foundational text of AA. Alcoholics Anonymous, it lays out their 12-step program for recovery. And Lisa's specifically referencing this idea of self-will run riot, which the Big Book describes as like a major obstacle to getting sober.
Right.
It speaks to this powerful force within the alcoholic that drives them to make choices that ultimately harm themselves, even when they know better.
So, connecting that back to Lisa's story, she's getting evicted, which is obviously a huge consequence of her drinking.
Right.
But she doesn't immediately see it that way.
Exactly. Her initial reaction is all about blame shifting.
Yeah.
It's the landlord's fault. The system is rigged against her, and so on. She's completely in denial about her own role in the situation, which is, it's a really vivid example of how the ego can just distort our perception and prevent us from taking responsibility for our actions.
It sounds almost like the ego is acting like a defense mechanism, protecting itself from the painful truth. And it's that same ego, according to Lisa, that's fueling her alcoholism.
That's the core of her argument, that this keen alcoholic ego, as she calls it, is the root of the problem. It's not just a physical addiction to alcohol.
Okay.
It's a deeper issue of the mind, or even the spirit. She actually goes so far as to say that alcoholism is a spiritual sickness.
Wow. Spiritual sickness. That's pretty powerful language.
Yeah.
What do you think she means by that?
Well, she describes this idea that the ego, driven by fear and a sense of separation, keeps us trapped in this cycle of self-destruction. It's like we build a wall around ourselves, preventing us from connecting with our true selves and with something larger than ourselves. And that's where that spiritual aspect comes in. The idea that true healing requires us to break down those walls and reconnect with our authentic selves, which she believes are rooted in love.
It's interesting that she frames it as this contrast between ego and love. So in Lisa's view, the ego is what's keeping her sick, and love is the potential cure.
That's a great way to put it. She actually uses a really interesting analogy to illustrate this point. She compares the ego to the villains in classic fairy tales.
Okay.
Like the wicked stepmother in Cinderella or the evil queen in Snow White.
Okay, now that's an analogy I can get behind.
Yeah.
I love a good fairy tale reference.
Yeah.
But how does that connect to alcoholism and the ego?
So think about those classic villains. They're obsessed with appearances, with power, getting external validation. They're constantly comparing themselves to others and trying to tear others down and make themselves feel better. And they're driven by fear. Fear of not being good enough, fear of losing control, fear of being exposed as a fraud. And Lisa argues that the ego operates in a very similar way, constantly seeking external validation and feeding off of that fear and insecurity.
So it's like the ego is this imposter pretending to be us, but it's actually just a bunch of negative thoughts and beliefs.
Yeah.
And that imposter is what's driving the destructive behaviors associated with alcoholism.
Precisely. And just like in those fairy tales, the real hero of the story is our true self.
Okay.
The part of us that's already whole and complete, the part that's capable of love and connection. But the ego, like the villain, tries to keep that true self hidden away, whispering these lies about our worthiness and keeping us trapped in this cycle of fear and self-doubt.
This is getting really fascinating. So if the ego is the problem, what's the solution? Lisa mentioned something about a spiritual solution, right?
Yes, she argues that since the root of the problem is spiritual,
Okay.
this disconnect from our true selves and from something larger than ourselves,
Hmm.
the solution must also be spiritual. She talks about the need to surrender the ego's control
Okay.
and reconnect with our authentic selves, which she believes are rooted in love.
Okay, so what does that actually look like in practice?
Yeah.
What does it mean to surrender the ego's control and reconnect with love?
That's where things get really interesting, and we'll dive deeper into that in the next part of our deep dive.
So we're talking about surrendering the ego and
Mhm.
reconnecting with love as a solution to this, like, spiritual sickness of alcoholism.
Right.
It honestly sounds a little abstract to me.
Yeah.
How do you actually do that? Like, is there like a step-by-step guide?
Well, that's the thing. Lisa doesn't offer a specific prescription.
How do
It's
you
not as simple as do these 5 things and you'll be cured. But she does hint at some important principles that resonate with a lot of recovery approaches.
Like, what kind of principles? Give me an example.
Well, one that really stands out is this idea of connecting with something larger than yourself.
Hmm.
She talks about surrendering to a higher power, which is, a core concept in AA.
Okay.
But it doesn't have to be a religious thing. It could be nature, art, a community, anything that helps you feel part of something bigger than your own ego.
Okay. I'm starting to see how that ties into the whole ego problem. If the ego is all about separation and self-centeredness, then maybe connecting to something bigger could help counter that.
Right. That's exactly the idea. It's about shifting from a mindset of like me versus the world to a sense of interconnectedness. And that can be incredibly powerful in breaking down the ego's defenses.
But isn't that, like, easier said than done?
Mm,
Especially for someone who is struggling with addiction where everything just feels so chaotic and out of control.
it definitely takes work. There's no magic bullet here.
Yeah.
But Lisa's story offers some clues about how to start.
Okay.
She talks a lot about the importance of self-awareness, of really paying attention to your thoughts
Hmm.
and recognizing when the ego is running the show.
So it's like you need to be able to spot the ego's tricks before you can even start to challenge them.
Exactly. It's about developing that discerning mind.
Okay.
Lisa even says, when you become aware of the keen alcoholic ego, you can start to see where it shows up in your life and in your thinking.
This is reminding me of mindfulness practices like meditation.
Mm.
Do you think those could be helpful in this process of recognizing the ego?
Absolutely. Mindfulness is all about cultivating awareness of the present moment without judgment.
Okay.
And that can be incredibly helpful in detaching from the ego's constant chatter
Yeah.
and getting some distance from those fear-based thoughts.
So it's not about trying to eliminate the ego completely,
Right.
because that's probably impossible.
Yeah.
It's more about learning to observe it,
Mm-hmm.
to see it for what it is,
Yeah,
and to make conscious choices rather than letting it run wild.
that's a great way to put it.
Yep.
It's about reclaiming your power as the chooser rather than being like a puppet of your ego.
Mm.
And Lisa emphasizes that this is an ongoing process, not a one-time fix.
She does mention that it's a daily reprieve contingent on maintenance,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It sounds like she's saying you have to be constantly vigilant, always on the lookout for those ego-driven thoughts and behaviors.
Exactly. It's like tending a garden. You have to keep weeding out the negative thoughts and cultivating the positive ones. And sometimes you have to go back and do some serious pruning when things get overgrown.
This is starting to feel less abstract and more like something you can actually work on day by day.
Yeah.
But what about the love part of the equation? How does that fit in?
Well, Lisa suggests that connecting with love is essential for true healing.
Okay.
But she doesn't mean like romantic love or even necessarily love for other people.
Yeah.
She's talking about a deeper, more fundamental kind of love for yourself, for life itself, for the interconnectedness of everything.
I think I understand what you mean. It's like that sense of awe and wonder you might feel when you're out in nature, or that feeling of deep peace and acceptance when you're truly present in the moment.
Exactly. And Lisa argues that this kind of love is actually our natural state.
Yeah.
It's who we truly are at our core. But the ego, with its fear and separation, blocks us from experiencing it fully.
So if alcoholism is a spiritual sickness, maybe it's because it's cutting us off from that source of love within ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe the spiritual solution is about finding our way back to that connection.
That's a really insightful way to put it.
Wow.
It's like we've gotten lost in the maze of the ego,
Yeah.
and we need to find our way back to the heart where love resides.
I'm really starting to see how Lisa's story, even the eviction incident, isn't just about alcoholism. It's actually touching on something much deeper,
Yeah.
about the human condition,
Yeah.
about how we all struggle with ego, with fear, with finding our way back to love.
And it's a struggle that's worth engaging with because the rewards are immense. As Lisa says, when you choose love over fear, you open yourself up to a whole new way of being in the world.
I love that. Choosing love over fear.
Yeah.
It sounds so simple, yet it's probably one of the most challenging things we can do as humans.
Absolutely. But Lisa's story shows us that it's possible and that the journey itself can be incredibly transformative. It's about taking those small steps day by day towards greater self-awareness, towards connection, towards love.
And speaking of taking steps, I'm curious about what Lisa says about the practical side of things.
Yeah,
She does talk about actions, not just feelings, right?
that's right. She emphasizes that this isn't just about having warm, fuzzy feelings.
Right.
It's about actually changing your behavior, making different choices, and taking responsibility for your actions.
So how does she bridge that gap between the spiritual and the practical? What kind of actions does she suggest taking?
That's where we'll pick up in the final part of our deep dive.
So we were just talking about how Lisa emphasizes taking action, like making different choices
Yeah,
as part of this journey.
right.
It's not enough to just have a spiritual awakening and then just go back to your old ways.
Yeah, exactly. She's very clear about that.
Okay.
It's about walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
Yeah.
And she gives some really concrete examples of what that can look like.
Okay, give me, for instance, what kind of actions does she recommend?
One that really resonated with me is this idea of practicing honesty, both with yourself and with others.
Okay.
She talks about how the ego thrives on secrets and lies.
Yeah.
It wants to keep things hidden and maintain a facade.
Okay.
So being rigorously honest is like shining a light on those dark corners and stripping away the ego's power.
That makes sense. Like if you're always trying to hide things or pretend to be someone you're not, you're essentially feeding the ego.
Yeah.
But if you're open and honest, you're being more authentic, more aligned with your true self.
Exactly. And that can be incredibly liberating, even if it's scary at first.
Yeah.
Lisa talks about how she used to be terrified of being vulnerable, of letting people see her flaws. But she realized that those flaws were actually part of what made her human,
Yeah.
part of what made her lovable.
It's like she had to let go of that need to be perfect, to be in control, to have it all together.
Right.
And in doing so, she actually found more freedom and connection.
That's a great way to put it. And she goes on to talk about other actions that support this process of surrendering the ego.
Okay.
Things like practicing gratitude, being of service to others, cultivating forgiveness. All of these actions help to shift our focus away from ourselves and towards something larger.
So it's like the more we give, the more we connect, the less power the ego has over us. It's not almost counterintuitive, like the opposite of what our culture often tells us.
That's the paradox, isn't it?
Yeah.
Our culture often tells us to focus on ourselves, to strive for success and achievement, to put our own needs first. But Lisa's experience and the experiences of countless others in recovery suggest that true fulfillment comes from something much deeper, something that transcends the ego's limited perspective.
And this is all really resonating with me. It's like if we're always striving, always trying to prove ourselves, we never really arrive.
Right.
But if we can let go of that struggle, that need for validation, then maybe we can finally find peace and contentment.
That's the essence of what Lisa is pointing to, I
Yeah.
think. It's about coming home to ourselves, to our true nature, which is love. And that journey begins by recognizing the ego for what it is, a temporary illusion, a trick of the mind.
Okay.
It's not who we truly are.
I love that image of the ego as a temporary illusion. It makes it seem less threatening somehow, more manageable.
Exactly. It's not something to be feared or hated. It's just something to be seen through. And once we see it for what it is, we can choose to align ourselves with something deeper, something more authentic.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. Lisa's story, even though it's just one person's experience, really illuminates some universal truths about the human condition.
Yeah.
It's like she's holding up a mirror, showing us how we all struggle with ego, with fear, with finding our way back to love.
And her message is ultimately one of hope. It's a reminder that no matter how lost we may feel, no matter how much we've messed up in the past, there's always a path back to wholeness, back to love.
And that path, as we've been discussing, isn't about willpower or self-control. It's about something much deeper, something more spiritual. It's about recognizing that our true selves are not separate, not broken, but already whole and connected to something much greater than ourselves.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
Yeah.
It's about surrendering to that truth, to that love, and allowing it to guide our thoughts, our actions, and our lives.
This deep dive has given me so much to think about. So for our listener, if you find yourself resonating with Lisa's story,
Yeah.
if you're struggling with similar challenges or simply curious about exploring this idea of the ego and its role in our lives, we encourage you to take a deeper dive yourself. Read Lisa's blog post, explore some of the concepts we've discussed today, and most importantly, be kind to yourself along the way.
Yeah.
Remember that you are not alone and that the journey itself is a gift.
Beautifully said. And remember, the path back to love is always open to us no matter where we are on our journey.